Mark 4, verses 35 to 41. Jesus calms the storm. That day, when evening came, he said to his disciples, "Let us go over to the other side." Leaving the crowd behind, they took him along, just as he was, in the boat. There were also other boats with him. A furious squall came up, and the waves broke over the boat, so that it was nearly swamped. Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. The disciples woke him and said to him, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" He got up, rebuked the wind, and said to the waves, "Be quiet, be still." Then the wind died down, and it completely was calm. He said to his disciples, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" They were terrified and asked each other, "Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him."
What you just heard is perhaps one of the most familiar stories of Jesus. And as we move through Mark's biography of Jesus' ministry, we hear countless miraculous stories just like this one. Although, how are we to make sense of this story? Jesus is busy doing ministry, he's preaching, he's healing, he's casting out demons, and he's tired from all of his work. And so he tells his disciples, let's get in the boat and let's get out of here. Let's go to the other side of the Sea of Galilee. And so as they travel, he's fatigued. So he takes a little nap in the back of the boat. And the Sea of Galilee was common to have storms like this one. See, Mount Huron was close to it, and the cool air from Mount Huron would come down, which would hit the warm air from the sea, and they would collide, and often, still to this day, cause sudden thunderstorms, squalls. These things happen. And the disciples were experienced fishermen. They were used to these kinds of storms, but this storm was different, so much so that they were terrified for their life. And so in their frantic state, their confusion of how Jesus is still sleeping through this storm, they wake him up and say, "We are surely going to die. Jesus, would you help us?" Jesus rubs his sleepy eyes and he rebukes the storm and the wind, the same way that he rebukes the demonic spirit with authority. And he says, "Be quiet, be still." And all of a sudden the sea is calm. And the disciples look at this Jesus who is just sleeping and they say, "Who is this Jesus?" This is the dominant question that Mark presents to you over and over again through his biography. Who is this Jesus? Who is this Jesus that can forgive sins, that can cast out demons? Who is this Jesus that calms the storm? Who is this Jesus? However, that question for many of us, there's something that gets in the way of us asking this question. See, as we hear the story about Jesus calming this storm, there's something that's giving us pause, something that's complicating the story of Jesus. To illustrate this, I have a whiteboard. So let me explain with a diagram. At the top of the diagram, we have Jesus. He's always, he's got to be at the top. That's how it works, right? We're at church. We got Jesus at the top of this diagram. And then at the bottom, we have us, or in this case, you. See, the time and the stories and the life of Jesus don't happen in a vacuum. The Bible doesn't happen in the vacuum. See, the stories of Jesus, they come to us in a certain time and context and language and history. Jesus is doing ministry in a time where there's cultural assumptions were norm and they were different than ours. So the story of Jesus and the stories we find in Mark come through us in all kinds of different contexts. They're written in a particular context. And I think we understand that. We understand that we have to interpret the Bible. If you've ever read the Bible before, you know parts of it are confusing. They don't make sense because they take place in a different time with different values and norms and language and culture expectations. But at the same time, you and I are not in a vacuum. Equally, you and I, as we hear the stories of Jesus, we are in a particular context as well. And our context is informed by many different things. It's shaped by the cultural norms that you and I assume, our language, our family of origin, our personality, our core beliefs. All of these things influence the way that we experience, that we hear the stories of Jesus. This was illustrated to me recently. I was doing an exercise with a group of individuals, and the facilitator would get a statement on a piece of paper, and he'd read the statement out loud, and then he would put it at the center of the floor of the room we were in. And he said, based on how much you agree with the statement, stand that close to the statement. How much you disagree with the statement, stand as further away from it. So the facilitator would read different statements and put it in the center of the room, and some individuals would get so close on it, they're almost standing on it, and other individuals would be as far as they possibly could. They would be pushed their body against the wall to demonstrate how much they would disagree with that statement. The same statement. However, every individual would understand that statement to mean different things based on what words were used, based on their core convictions and beliefs, based on their culture and the history where they came from, based on so many different factors. People interacted with statements differently based on that. I say all this, I make this illustration to communicate there's much going on between Jesus and us. There's lots of different realities and complexities between the story of Jesus, which you just heard, and your own life. There's much going on between Jesus and ourselves, and there is real aspects about Jesus that they don't fit into our paradigm of how we see the world. There's a fundamental question that many of us in Vancouver are asking about this story that we are wrestling with. A question that most likely has been raised in your thinking as we've been journeying through the biography of Mark as for Jesus' life. A question that we need to unpack before we can receive this story, and quite frankly, many of the stories of Jesus' biography. And that question for us is this true? Is this story about Jesus, is it true? See, this question emerges for us because we come out of the dominant cultural norm of being products of the scientific age. And for many of us, we find our authority and what we trust is in science. And science tells us that storms cannot simply be silenced by somebody simply saying so. See, the results of being people of the scientific age are that some people see the Bible simply as allegorical. That these stories are only metaphors to help us understand how we tackle life's problems, but they are not really grounded in reason or reality. See, the challenge of Jesus' biography is communicated in common sentiments like, my scientific training makes it difficult, if not impossible, to accept the teachings of Christianity. Or others would say things like, the Bible is filled with accounts of miracles like the one we just read. They simply could not have happened. They don't fit into our paradigm of what we know how the world operates. And behind this rhetoric is the belief that religion was meaningful when we didn't understand science. But now that we understand science, we understand how the world works, that has made belief in God obsolete or unnecessary. See, stories like this one of Jesus calming the storm can create an intellectual barrier for us. And before we can appreciate what Mark is trying to show us, we need to acknowledge the barrier. We need to acknowledge there's things going on between Jesus and us. So today, we are going to look at this relationship between science and faith and address the obvious questions that arise when we hear such stories. How do I reconcile science and miracles? Am I supposed to suspend reason? Is this place, church, is it a place where I leave my brain at the door and we just come and we sing these songs and we learn about these stories of Jesus, but they're disconnected from this rationale? Now, for some of you, this might seem like a bit of a rabbit trail. However, it's my observation that this is one of the essential questions that we must address if we're going to ask the question that Mark poses to us over and over again. Who is this Jesus? So to do this, we're going to look at it in three parts. We're first going to look at the relationship of faith and science. Secondly, the limits of science. And then thirdly, the invitation that Mark presents to you today. First, faith and science. To clarify, what I mean when I say science is the study of the structure and behavior of the physical and natural world. That's what we mean when we say science, and science has become the popular way that many of us view the world. Much of our schooling is scientific in nature. You can get a computer science degree, a social science degree, even a veterinarian science degrees. But in my experience, this conversation between the relationship of science and faith is often framed as an either-or proposition. The common assumption is that if you take science seriously, faith must be left behind. Like that one individual who says, my scientific training makes it difficult, if not impossible, to accept the teachings of Christianity. So the common assumption is that if you take science seriously, faith must be left behind. And if you have faith, you can't fully embrace science. This, however, is a newer idea. Some of the greatest scientists that we have in history that have made some of the most brilliant revelations of what we know scientifically were Christians, including Kepler, Newton, Galileo, and so many more. And all of these scientists were captivated by science and studied it because of the core conviction that the world had an intelligent designer behind it. It was their conviction that held that the world was structured, that God designed it. And because there was structure, because there was a God, then therefore it could be studied because there was structure. Their things made sense. But this wasn't just Christians of old. Even today, Francis Collin, an outspoken Christian, led the groundbreaking research and work on the Human Genome Project, which detailed and provided a detailed blueprint of human genetics as we know it today. He went on to lead the U.S. National Institute of Health, no small portfolio. But he held science and faith together. He saw faith and science as compatible. You can have both in your life. Furthermore, as followers of Jesus, we should not be anti-science. Good data and scientific research are helpful, meaningful. Some of the best things that we have come from scientific research. A few weeks ago, in this service, we invited you to do a church-wide survey with us. And we do this every year, some random Sunday in May. And the point of us doing this is to us have a better understanding of our church demographics. We did this last year, and we found out that almost half of our community is single. That changes the way we do things. It changes the way we communicate. It helps us understand who the context of the people we're talking to. It gives us information and good data for us to make decisions based on those things. So we shouldn't be anti-science. Science can and should be used in different settings and has been really helpful. However, there is another challenge to this common rhetoric, though. The claim that belief in God requires faith, whereas belief in science does not. There's this false dichotomy that's often created. And that's expressed in, secondly, the limits of science. We have seen how, especially over the last century, rationality and science has replaced what morality and spirituality had in our culture and society as a whole. And one of the main reasons I think this is true is that many believe that science can be more trusted than things like spirituality and morality. Charles Colson, the famous 20th century thinker, says this: the standard assumption is that science constitutes objective knowledge, while religion is an expression of its subjective need. One's objective, the other's subjective. This has resulted, he goes on to say, to create the philosophical view is known as scientism, which not only regards science as valuable, but also elevates it as the only way to evaluate life. In other words, everything is viewed through a scientific framework. Colson again goes on, he says, this view assumes that the only things that are real are those that can be known and measured by experience and observation. Everything else is unreal, a product of subjective fantasy, including things like love and beauty, good and evil, God and consciousness. Therefore, scientism concludes that science can answer any and all questions. But is this true? See, there are real challenges to this view, which has become the dominant view, which make many of us hesitant when we hear a story like Jesus that we just heard. Many of us walk into a place like this with this dominant view of the world, and we have real barriers and obstacles of Jesus' story. We find some metaphorical meaning in it, but realistically, I'm not so sure. What are the challenges here? Well, first of all, science needs a level of faith. Numerous scholars have demonstrated that there are plenty of assumptions that scientists must hold to believe in scientism, that science is the best way to answer all of life's questions. The most obvious is that the position of scientism itself cannot be scientifically proven, but is rather a philosophical one. I know this is heavy. We're going to get back to Mark real soon. Just stick with me. It's really helpful. See, it's a philosophical position. You can't prove scientifically that science is the best way to study the world. In other words, the claim that science is the only source of truth is a philosophical claim, not a scientific one. Both worldviews, that of belief in God and belief in science, ultimately rest on assumptions that cannot themselves be established by scientific experiments. Second challenge with this view is it's lacking answers. Science might tell you how the galaxy works, but it doesn't tell you what your meaning you have in it. Science might tell you what happens to your body when you fall in love, but it can't adequately measure one's love for another person. Wade Rowland says, along the way, however, people lost track of the fact that science describes, it does not explain. Wesley Huff is a Canadian apologist who recently sat in an interview with Stephen Bartlett. And in it, he describes how science has a harder time answering questions around meaning and purpose. And to do this, he gives this parable about Betty the botanist. A botanist is someone who studies plants, by the way. He goes on, he says this, so you have Betty the botanist, and she's been looking at a plant sample in her lab. She's been spending all weekend investigating it and doing all of these tests on it. And then Jerry, the lab assistant, comes in on Monday, and Betty looks at Jerry and says, Jerry, thank you for the botanical specimen that you left me on the weekend. I've been doing all these tests. I've been looking at the components of it and the complexity of the biology, and there are pharmacological implications that I've extrapolated from its various biological components, and we can use these to cure diseases. There's so many things. Thank you so much for the botanical specimen. Jerry says, Betty, it was February 14th on the weekend. That was a long stem rose. Do you know what I left for you? Do you know the implication of the botanical specimen as you're calling it? Was for what I was trying to communicate something to you. Now, did Betty the botanist understand the long stem rose? Well, in one way, she understood it more than most of us, because she did all these tests and run through all of the different ways that she could extrapolate what the thing was. But what Jerry was trying to actually illustrate was something that went beyond that. It was a gift of love and affection. He was trying to communicate something that went beyond the simple biology. Science is one of the greatest inventions that we have had. We have so much to be grateful for because of it. However, it cannot address all of life's questions. We can look at the scientific explanations, but some things go beyond the simple data. Questions of your identity, questions of what purpose and meaning is found in life. The data won't clearly articulate these things to you. To summarize, faith and science, they can be compatible. Well-meaning, good thinking individuals have held both and have found no tension, no war between those two. As well, both belief in science and belief in God do require some level of faith or trust in some assumptions that we can't scientifically prove. And lastly, there are limits that find many of us wandering into places like this because we can't seem to find answers in the ways that society continues to tell us where answers come from. So what is the invitation? Now that we've addressed some of the things that are going on here between the story of Jesus and our own cultural biases and assumptions and the things that we're carrying, what's the invitation that Jesus has for us? What do we do with this tension that we're holding? What challenge does Jesus calming the storm have for us? Well, let's go back to the story. Listen to how the disciples respond in verse 40. He said to the disciples, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" The disciples looked at Jesus and they were terrified and asked each other, "Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him." See, in this story, first the disciples were terrified of the storm, for it was out of their control. They've seen storms before, but this storm was different, and they thought surely they were going to die. This storm was more than they could manage. All of their efforts could not save them, and so they frantically begged and woke up Jesus from his slumber to save them from this storm, which Jesus, in response, calms the storm. And now they're not terrified of the storm, they're terrified of Jesus. Who is this that even the waves and the wind obey him? Why? Why are the disciples terrified of Jesus in this moment? Well, see, the storm threatened their lives, but Jesus threatens their illusion of control. They have come face to face with the Creator, the one who has authority over the storm. And if the storm scares them, imagine the one who controls the storm. This changes everything that they know, the whole paradigm of how they view the world and what they understand, and their lack of control has never been more apparent than in that moment right then. The intellectual Wendell Berry, in his great essay, Life is a Miracle, with his subtitle, An Essay Against Modern Superstition, he outlines that the rise in scientism, what we just talked about, is this idea, or really the assumption, that the world is a Darwinian material reality, nothing more than blind chance. There's no God, therefore there are no miracles. Thus, by modern superstition, he means the modern bias against the miraculous. It is the culture assumption many of us are walking with. It's what's fed to us day in and day out. But the key insight that Wendell Berry argues is that human beings, we are so tempted to believe that if we can understand something, then we can and should control it. Our temptation is if we simply can understand something, then we can control it and understand it. That's me. I want to control something. I want to analyze it. I want to take it apart, because if I think I can understand it, then I think I can control it and it won't hurt me, it won't affect me, it won't challenge me. Things can fit into my paradigm and my boxes. To say it another way, the conversation is not necessarily an intellectual one if miracles exist with science. This is also a way for many of us to protect ourselves from the things that are out of our control. The big idea of Mark is to slap us in the face with the person of Jesus. It's the question that he asks over and over and over again. Who is this Jesus? How do we make sense of him? Who is this Jesus who calms the storms, who casts out demons, who forgives sins, who sits with sinners? Who is this Jesus who breaks the Sabbath? Who is this Jesus? Does not fit into our paradigms. His reality shatters our understanding of how the world works. He doesn't fit nicely into our controlled hypothesis. We can't test and analyze. He is simply out of our control. And if we're honest, even those of you who've been going to church for a while, we like a God, we are comfortable with a God that we can analyze and explain, and a God that can fit into our nicely categories. But Mark is presenting a Jesus to us that is challenging, that's confronting us with a Jesus who refuses to stay in our categories. Many modern individuals believe what cannot be controlled, measured, and explained cannot be trusted. So Mark, in his biography of Jesus, isn't primarily trying to answer 21st century question about science and miracles. He's asking a deeper question of you and I. Who is this Jesus? And what does his authority reveal about our need for control? Our discipleship, our allegiance, our trust, our ability to follow Jesus. Our discipleship of Jesus challenges this assumption of our illusion of control. Any follower of Jesus that I've talked with or I've sat with who followed Jesus for longer than a day know one of the greatest challenges is to surrender control. And it might for you not be control over the weather, but it might be control might look different for you. It's control over the future, control over the well-being of your kids. Control over your plans will work out the way that you hope they will. Control over your body and as you age and things shift. The invitation that Mark gives us is to loosen our tyranny of control, to trust in the one who calms the winds and the waves of life. There is one who enters the storm of your life, that your ultimate help is outside of yourself. It is the one that's outside of your control. In other words, Mark is saying, look beyond underneath the microscope to the unknown, to the mystery, to the one who has authority of it all. Jesus consistently didn't fit into their box of reality, and he consistently doesn't fit into ours either. Some of you feel like you got a knack of who Jesus. I know who God. He fits right in. I got him. I know who he is. And we classify it as good theology or good understanding or good discipleship. But on the other side of that is just our ability to simply control even who God is and how he shows up and what he looks like. Mark's inviting us to release control to the one who has authority of it all. Even if that doesn't always fully make sense to us or even always look rational. Jesus consistently didn't fit into their box of reality, and he doesn't fit into ours either. The real question for you and I, the question that Mark is presenting to you today is, are you willing? Are you willing to trust the one who controls the wind and the waves of life? Are you willing to trust Jesus, to manage all the things in your life, and to give up the illusion that life can simply be mastered. I'm going to invite the keys to come up, and I want to close with this thought. Today, on the third Sunday of the month, is communion. Communion is an ancient practice of the church that's been doing since the very beginning. And communion for us is not just simply a rhythm of tradition. It's not something that we should do, so we do. But communion is a beautiful symbol of what we just were presented to by Mark. We take a cracker and some grape juice, and we take it as a community together, and we remember the life, the death, the resurrection of Jesus. Communion is a moment that we embody this level of trust. There's one thing for us to talk about it. There's one thing for us to intellectually think about it. There's something else when we take our body and we come up and we receive communion and we take these elements together. There's something that we are embodying, this reality of trust. Our body, we're leading with our bodies, it's whole body worship. Our body is communicating something that's going on. We're telling our mind. It's an act of receiving. We come and we receive the juice and the cracker as a representation of the grace that signifies our inability to save ourselves. Communion acknowledges that our help comes from outside of our control. It's not a demonstration of having all the answers. When we come up and we receive communion, it's not that we've got it all figured out. Walking forward does not mean we have it all together or that somehow we don't have any more doubts. It simply is us receiving grace. It is a process of acknowledging who Jesus is and what he has done. That's what communion is. It's as simple as that.